We are talking today with Paul Hansmann of Coon Rapids, Minnesota. The interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project, and we're conducting this interview at the 2015 Ripcord reunion. Hey, Paul, can you start off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born in August 28, 1948, in Cincinnati, Ohio.
All right. Did you grow up in Cincinnati, or did you move around?
I was there until I was in 5th grade, and then we moved to Springfield, Illinois. And I stayed in Springfield and graduated from high school in Springfield.
And what did your family do for a living when you were growing up?
My dad was a baker, and he worked for a commercial bakery all of his life. And my mom was a stay-at-home mom most of the time. Later on, she went to work for the Salvation Army.
Okay. And so what year did you finish high school?
I graduated from high school in 1966.
Okay. And then what did you do after graduation?
I went to college in Cedarville, Ohio, which is a Baptist college. And I went 2 years there, and then I dropped out of college there and went back to Illinois and got a job in the bakery and worked in the bakery for a while. And that's when, that would have been 1968, and my wife and I got married in 68. She was, I met her at college, and we got married in Iowa. She came from a farm background, and we were married in Iowa in 1968.
Okay. Now, were you aware of the possibility that once you're out of college you might get drafted?
I was aware of that, and I didn't, kind of a little bit of a rebellious part of my background, and I didn't necessarily give a whole lot of thought to it, but I thought, no, after I get married, I probably won't get drafted, so, you know.
Yeah, and if that had been a few years earlier, you would have been right. Because it was an exemption there for a while. All right. Now, when do you get your draft notice?
Got my draft notice in we got married in June of 68. I got my draft notice probably in September time frame of 68, and was told to report, I think it was the 1st of February, end of January, 1st of February in 69.
Okay. Now, did you go through a physical as part of this process?
Yes.
All right. And where did you do that?
In St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay. And when you went for the physical, did you notice anybody trying to beat the system or get disqualified, or were you all cooperating?
Pretty much all cooperating. I didn't notice, it seemed like that most of us were, if we had an ailment or something like that, you tended to hide it rather than play it up. See, that was from my perspective anyway, that's what it seemed like.
All right. How much did you know about the war in Vietnam at that time?
Not very much.
Okay.
Really not. My dad was a World War II veteran, and so that's probably why it didn't bother me one way or another. If it was my duty to serve, then so be it.
Yeah. And were you aware at all of the anti-war movement going on?
Oh yes. Yeah, there was, the college that I went to out in Ohio was very close to Antioch University. And of course they were, me being from a Baptist background and them being from Antioch, there was a lot of drugs in Antioch and long hairs and war protesters, and so we saw a lot of that.
Yeah. But they were sort of the other guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Different.
Yeah, Cedarville and Antioch are about as opposite as you could get probably at that point.
We were.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So You know, you go physical. Where do you go for basic training?
Went from St. Louis, where we got the physical and the swear-in procedure, and went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina for
Okay.
basic training.
All right. When you got to Fort Bragg, I mean, were there many people from? Were you drafted officially out of Ohio, as opposed, or out of Illinois?
Out of Illinois.
Okay, and they sent you to Fort Bragg.
Right.
Were there a lot of guys from Illinois there, or?
Not a lot, but I had one very close friend who, he and I went to the same church when we were in high school. And he went to a different high school, but we were in the same church together, so we were in youth group and stuff together. And we got drafted on the same day. He was also married,
Mm-hmm.
so that we had that in common, and so we went through basic training together.
All right. When you get to Fort Bragg, what kind of reception do you get?
Loud and proud. A lot of screaming, a lot of yelling. February in Fort Bragg, North Carolina was cold and sandy, but it was a lot of screaming and yelling and kicking things and trash cans banging, and you just kept quiet.
Right. Yes. Welcome to the Army right away.
That's right.
Now, do you have a few days of processing before the regular training starts?
None that I remember. They kind of mixed that in as things went along. Spent a lot of time doing push-ups and.
All right, so okay, because it seems to vary from place to place for what kind of experience you get. Of course, Bragg is home of like 82nd Airborne,
Mm-hmm.
so there may be some of that rubbing off there. I don't know, but okay. So they're working you out pretty hard. Did you have any idea of what to expect when you got there?
Absolutely none.
All right.
I had heard horror stories, but really didn't have any idea firsthand of what to expect. So it was kind of a rude awakening, people yelling at you, and they were more interested in getting you into physical condition, and which that didn't intimidate me at all because I'd played basketball in college,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was in pretty decent shape, but
Okay. So how long did it take you to adjust to the Army way of doing things?
not very long. They saw to it that you just kept your mouth shut and did what you were told, and that's exactly what the goal was, is to react to orders, not with a questioning mind, but with just a blind following.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then, aside from the PT part, what does the training consist of in basic?
Weapons training, familiarizing yourself with the language, the phonetic alphabet, the map reading skills, a lot of that kind of stuff. All different types of weapons that you would use later. How to talk on a radio, how to wire explosives, a lot of different things.
Okay. Now, the drill instructors, what proportion of them do you think had been to Vietnam?
Darn close to 100%.
Okay. All right. Did anybody say anything about Vietnam, or was it just all by the book?
Oh, no, there was a lot, especially in the harassment stages, as they were training us. There was a lot of them that, would talk about, if you don't do this, you're not going to survive, and because that was the thought process at that point in time, is that everybody was going.
Mm-hmm.
You were here, you were going to Vietnam, period.
Yeah, because early '69 was about the peak in terms of American numbers in Vietnam, and would go down after that, but they were training a lot of people at that point. Yeah. Okay. So you do that, and were there other guys who were having trouble with the training, or would wash out or get put behind?
Yeah, there were quite a few. A lot of the guys were out of shape, somewhat soft, and then you had guys on the other end of the spectrum that were it was a cakewalk for them. So it was, you had some on both sides, but not a whole lot washed out. They kind of got them back around and got them in better shape.
All right. Now, how long did the training last?
Basic training was 8 weeks.
Okay. And what do they do with you next?
We went to Fort McClellan, Alabama for advanced infantry training. And it was a beautiful scenario. Let me back up just a little bit. Toward the end of my training in basic, I contracted double pneumonia. So they took me into the hospital, and temperature was around 105, and they packed me in ice and got my fever down and everything. So my lungs were all full, and I was a pretty sick boy for a while. And I spent a week in the hospital, and they wanted to keep me there. And I talked them into letting me out because I knew if I stayed more than a week, they would make me go back through basic training again and recycle. And the only thing I really had to complete yet was a ending physical training test, a PT test they called it. So I had to pass that in order to graduate. All my test scores and everything had all been completed, and they were fine. So I had to go out and go do a PT test, and I still had double pneumonia, naturally. And running a mile when you've got double pneumonia is a challenge, believe me.
All right.
But we went from there to Fort McClellan, Alabama, and it was basically more of the same training, not quite as much yelling, and more in-depth training, I would say.
Are you getting more into tactics and that kind of thing now?
Yeah, we were a lot more map reading, observation, learning how to navigate. We had night navigation courses, survival training, that type of thing.
Did they make any effort to sort of simulate conditions in Vietnam?
They tried to, as much as you can with Alabama, and it's totally different country, but it was, they did pretty well at that.
What would they do in terms of that? What would they try to show you?
They would set up booby traps, punji pits, those kind of things. How to be aware of your surroundings and look for certain things. What trails, they would look like in Vietnam, and what to look for and that type of thing.
Okay. And because at a certain point you wind up getting selected to go to NCO school. Now, was that a decision that was made back in basic, or is that at AIT, or how did that happen?
I think that was at AIT, and they had a battery of tests, and they selected people based on test scores, a lot of it, and in different areas, not only physical test scores, but also on aptitude and decision making and those type of things. So I was selected to go to NCO school. I had the opportunity to turn it down if I wanted to, but my logic at that point in time was I had done the calculation on, okay, how much time does it take for each one of these? And I thought that it would be a lot better to spend as much time as I could in the States and be able to have my wife come down and live off post, and then go to Vietnam so that when I came home I would be out. Or if I didn't come home, then I would have spent as much time with her as I could have. So that was the logic pattern I used.
All right. So in the first stages of training, she wouldn't have been there, right? I mean, she was back at home. But,
Right.
And then, how long was the NCO school scheduled to last?
NCO school was 10 weeks.
Okay.
And she came down after probably a couple weeks. Her and the friend of mine who went to Fort Bragg with me, we had gone through all the same training together, and he was also selected for NCO school. And so his wife and my wife loaded up the car and they came down together.
Okay.
And they stayed off post.
All right. And what kind of accommodation did they find? Do you remember that?
Trailer.
Okay.
They lived in a trailer outside of Fort Benning. And they became very good friends, close friends, and did everything together. And then they could come in and visit us on Wednesday nights. And then on the weekends, we generally got a pass. The married guys got a pass to go off back to the trailer and spend the weekend with them.
All right. Now, what was the NCO training like?
A lot of leadership skills, how to direct men, how to position them, how to just be in charge. They were trying to train leaders, and in all aspects, I guess.
Okay. And this was again geared toward Vietnam?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That was.
And the people training you, and were they sharing any of their own experiences, or were they just focusing on here are these skills and just do it this way?
I got to know a few of them, and at nights, sometimes they would share some stories. But you find out that after you've been to Vietnam, it's pretty hard to talk to somebody about it that hasn't been there, or doesn't understand. But you start to, as you get to know them and they get a little more comfortable with it, then yeah, they would share, especially if you pointedly ask them questions. Then they would generally.
Okay. Now, by this time, did you want to know as much as you could about what you were getting into, or were you just kind of just going through the program?
Just going through the program. I really didn't. I really didn't try to learn anything extra as far as what they had been through or what to look forward to, because I knew that everyone was going to be different.
Okay. So that was a 10-week course. You finished that. Now what do they do with you?
Well, then we had to go what they called OJT, and on-the-job training. So we went to Fort Polk, Louisiana, and went down there and were the cadre, the sergeants, for a basic training company that was going through their cycle. So we went through their cycle as their NCOs for 8 weeks. And our wives, we actually lived off post then, because my friend and I both went there, and of course the wives went along, and we lived off post with them in a 10 by 50 trailer for a while. And we were off post, had to be back on post like at 4:30 in the morning. So we would leave in the middle of the night and go back to post and then come back home that evening.
Right. Because you're sergeants now at this point,
right.
so you've got a little bit more status and a few other things. How did the more experienced, because you would have had other trainers there who had been to Vietnam and that kind of thing, how did they treat you guys?
Like shake and bakes. You know, that, yeah, we had stripes, but we didn't know anything yet. And they were very much accurate. We had the rank, and we had the authority over the
Recruits.
troops,
Yeah.
but as far as being, if you had a E5 buck sergeant who had been to Vietnam and was back, and he had the same rank as we did, there was absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind who was in charge. So.
All right. Now, when you're doing your training, whether it was in Fort Benning or at Fort Polk, were they taking any advantage of the available terrain? I mean, did you get train in swamps at all? Or
Oh yes. A lot of our, and it got progressively more so as you went to Fort Polk because of the availability of all the swamps and the really nasty jungle type atmosphere, and so it was much more in our thought processes. Is, you know, this could be more what it's like.
And what time of year were you at Fort Polk?
Fort Polk, I was in
Late summer or?
late summer. Yeah, it had to be. We left Fort Polk probably 15th of December. So
And how long a stint did you have there?
8 weeks.
Okay.
So we've been
So kind of
back it up from.
Okay, so back in a kind of early fall, but in Louisiana that could still be pretty hot and muggy.
It was.
Yeah.
And it was. It wasn't terribly nasty, but it was definitely warm.
And so I guess some of the time at Fort Benning would have been pretty hot too.
Fort Benning was very hot, extremely so.
And did working in that kind of climate, did that help you at all when you got to Vietnam?
Some, probably, some. I don't. We couldn't relate to the conditions because we couldn't duplicate the weight load that you had to carry. If you had to go back and redesign it, you would probably change, because we didn't carry a full rucksack. We didn't carry all the ammo, all the things that we had to hump around in the jungle. You can't duplicate that.
Yeah. The water and the sea rations and all the rest of that.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So you've gone through all of this stuff. You get now to the end of the year, and do you get a leave before you have to go to Vietnam? Is that
Yeah,
what
I
I'm
had
saying?
2 weeks before we had 2 weeks or 30 days. Don't remember. But before I had to go to Vietnam. And that was somewhat tough, somewhat scared to death, not knowing what the future holds.
And did you take your wife back home to get resettled, or? Okay.
Took her back home, and she actually lived with her parents. At that point in time, she was pregnant with our son, and so it was that was tough. It was challenging.
Okay. And then where do you ship out from? Do you go to Oakland or Fort Lewis or somewhere else?
Yeah, Fort Lewis is where we left the States from. And I thought that first flight took forever. It was like 21 hours. We went from Fort Lewis to Alaska to Japan to Wake Island and then into Cam Ranh.
All right. And I'm not sure Wake is exactly on the way. Guam, maybe.
Yeah, but they made a little puddle stop there, and I have no idea why.
Okay, well, it's possible.
I don't know. It could have been Guam. One of the times I stopped at Wake.
Yeah, Wake might, if you went back to California, Wake is a stop.
I stopped at Wake Island one time, and I can't remember.
Did you have an R&R in Hawaii eventually?
Yes.
Yeah,
did.
well, that might have been for that, because that would have been in between.
Yeah.
All right, so you end up doing these things enough, okay, I'm learning the routes.
Yeah.
All right, so yeah, okay, but it's still, basically, it's just this tremendously long flight you take over. Did you get off the plane in Alaska or in Japan, or did you just stay on?
We got off the plane, and it was terribly cold in Alaska. And but it was. We got off the plane, got to stretch our legs, and then got back on and kept on going.
Okay, so where do you land in Vietnam?
Cam Ranh Bay.
Okay, did you come in during the day or at night?
Came in during the day.
Okay, and what's your first impression of Vietnam?
Like a slum. and we got off the plane, and naturally they're filing guys onto other planes that have served their tours, and that was a very eye-opening experience. That didn't do anything to calm my fears, let's put it that way.
Okay. Now, were they paying any attention to you, or did they just look scary, or?
They looked like they'd been through hell, and they had been, and it was they looked so much older than us. I remember that sight of, where are all these old guys, you know, and they looked tough.
And you were probably older than quite a few of them.
Yeah, I was probably a couple years older
Yeah.
than a lot of the guys that were with us.
All right. So now you get off the plane, what do they do with you?
We had a 7-day in-country training, getting aware of what's going on, did some rappel work, did some just general indoctrination of what to look for, what to back through the booby trap scenario, and getting your weapon and getting comfortable with the surroundings, adjusting to the climate, those type of things.
Did they try to teach you anything about the Vietnamese society or how to deal with the people, or was it just military stuff?
Most of it, as I recall, was just military.
Okay. Now, at what point do you know what your assignment is?
Sometime during that week, they, and I would guess based on what the casualties were and what was going on, they determined where they needed you. So
Okay. Okay. And so what do they assign you to?
we were assigned to I was assigned to the 2nd of the 506th Bravo Company.
Okay.
And I was put in, I didn't know which platoon at that point in time. That didn't happen until I got to the company area, but
Okay. Just so for the record, sort of B Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Regiment, 101st Airborne Division.
that's exactly right.
Yeah, the person making the notes will appreciate that. Okay. And where were they based at that time?
They were based out of Camp Eagle, Camp Evans, and that was up close to Fubai.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was our next stop. We took I think it was a C-130 up there, which was in I Corps, the northernmost area in Vietnam.
Right, in the area where really the most activity had been going on in the previous year,
That's
hence the most losses. Okay, so I guess Camp Eagle is it Phu Bai, which is close to Hue, and then Camp Evans, I guess, is a little bit north of that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
closer
exactly
to
right.
Pine Tree. Yeah, and Evans was where the 3rd Brigade was based, and that's what your battalion was part of.
That's right.
Okay, and so you get up to Camp Evans. Was the company there, or were they in the field somewhere?
Company was in the field,
Okay,
and all we had was just the new recruits or the new replacement people were there, and we were only there probably 2 days.
did they give you a training course up there, or?
Not much. Everything, training from that point in time was live fire.
Okay.
You know, and you were going to learn as you went.
Yeah.
If you survived, you learned.
Because a lot of the guys went through sort of the Screaming Eagles replacement training thing, which was like a week of orientation and patrolling and that kind of stuff. But it might have just depended on the timing for you.
Could have done some of that. I don't recall.
Okay. Now, how do you wind up joining the unit? Do you wait for them to come back, or do you go out?
Went out on a resupply helicopter, and they had blown an LZ. Well, no, it wasn't. It was kind of more down in the foothills at that point in time, so you could secure an LZ and get your.
Oh yeah, I forgot to stick with that reserve sign. Okay, so you were in sort of the lowland area.
Yes, and it was relatively quiet at that point in time. So I had the opportunity. I was put in charge of the squad, even though I didn't know anything. But I was the highest rank, so I was a squad leader. Had, I'm going to say 6 or 7 guys.
Okay, and how did you approach that? They'd been there longer than you. How did you deal with them or introduce yourself to them?
Well, my point to them was, at this point in time, when we go to the field, take all the stripes off, take all the insignias off. We're all have one point here, is at the end of a year, we all get to go home. You guys know what you're doing. I would like for you guys to train me so that, you know, if there's communication between me and the higher ups, I'll handle that. But as far as what we do in the field, I need to learn as much from you as I can.
Okay. And then how did they respond to that?
They were very, very helpful. I mean, they knew that the more that they could teach me, the less apt I was to get them killed.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a crash course, but they were very good at it, and they became very close friends.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you have a sense of how long they had been with the unit, or maybe?
Yeah, that was the initial conversation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the icebreaker, so to speak, is okay. How long have you been here?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then it goes from there. Where are you from? You know,
Yeah.
what do you do? What are you gonna do? And we found some common ground in different areas and things.
Yeah. Had some of them been there long enough to have been in the Ashaw Valley the year before? Or,
Yes.
Yeah, that kind of thing. So they had seen some real combat and
Yep.
and that kind of thing.
One of my closer friends had been had gotten a Silver Star from the year before, and so he had been there and knew what it was all about, and was. I knew they knew what they were talking about, and so.
So when was it exactly that you joined them? Do you know the approximate date for that? Or what month anyway? Is it still January?
It had to be in February
February.
sometime,
Okay.
I think.
All right. And then, so were you patrolling in that area for a while before you went anywhere else?
What they called search and destroy missions, which a lot of searching, not much destroying really going on at that point in time, but just familiarizing yourself with the areas and what to do and what not to do, and how to set up night defensive positions, and just how to survive being out in the jungle.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how much of a pack did you have to carry once you're out doing that?
It started out as one thing, and then as you learned more, you figured out what you needed and what you didn't need.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say our rucksack ran in that 60, 65 pound range. Depending on, some guys had an affinity for hand grenades, and some guys carried extra belts of M60 ammo, and it varied from person to person, but you allowed them that freedom because they knew what they were doing, and I was to learn.
Okay. Now, when you're out there in the lowland area, did you have any enemy contact?
No, not really. We didn't. We found some spider holes and things like that. Some areas where some booby traps had been set up and things like that, and blew them up, but not really any enemy contact.
Okay. And then at what point does their mission change? When do you go there somewhere else?
Yeah, the mission changed for me, and I'm having a hard time relating the dates, but we kind of kept moving farther and farther to the west, getting closer and closer to the mountains, and I got more experience. Sometime along in March, the company commander had put together what was called a battalion killer team. And basically what it was a recon team, and we had 5 guys on it. And I was chosen as one of them, and I went out with a friend of mine named Joe Strucky, and he had extended his tour, so he had already been in Vietnam probably 14 months. And he went out as a leader, and the process was for us to go into the mountains around the Ripcord AO, and we CA'd in there and rappelled in, And then we were left out there for 2 weeks. And just to report back every night what was going on, to avoid contact. And Joe Struckey had done this before, and he was good at it, and had been through a lot of stuff. So he was training me to be the leader of the, so he was only with us for that 2-week period, and basically to train all of us and me to be able to do what recon work they wanted done. So after the first 2-week period, then we got resupplied, and Joe left us, and then there was just me and the 4 other guys, and we did that for another cycle, or cycle and a part of another one maybe, and did that. We made no contact. It was basically a hide and seek scenario. We saw Vietnamese, but we were to not engage them at that point in time, just report back.
So now is this March going into April that you're doing?
No, this had to be
all,
in March.
all in March, okay.
All in
So
March.
before April 1st, all right. So, and what were you observing at that time? You could see enemy, what are they doing?
Troop movements and troop numbers, what size units they were working in, you know, whether they're farther down in the foothills, there may be 2 or 3. As you got into the heavier concentrations, there may have been 6 or 8 moving together. So just reporting troop movements and staying out of sight.
Now, was this scarier work than what you had done earlier?
Oh yeah, it ramped up, because when you saw, you know, 6 or 8 of them out there, and you know there's only 5 of you, it wasn't those 6 or 8 that you were worried about. It was, you know, what's going to happen from there.
All right. And did you have any close calls while camped out at night, or situations where they almost step on you?
Yeah, and generally not late at night. It was generally getting toward dusk and that type of thing, when they may be walking down a trail, and of course we were buried back in the jungle as much as we could be, and you just hope that nobody rattled anything. But the guys were hand selected, so we knew which ones. No one snored, no one smoked, no one, you know, those type of things that were conducive to hiding. So.
All right. Now, did you encounter any wildlife? I mean, were there snakes or other kinds of things?
Snakes and quick little weasel, whatever they were called. I can't remember now. Its name escapes me, but mongoose.
Yeah.
Mongoose and every now and then you'd see a rat and whatnot, but a lot of snakes. And more mosquitoes than you could put in the country, or ought to put in the country. So.
And could you do anything to protect yourself against the mosquitoes?
It took a while. Used to put on the bug spray, but once we went out there on this team, then that stopped.
Yeah.
So
that would smell distinctive.
That's right. So you quit using that. And we had become, by that point in time, you began to smell like the jungle. Because when I first went to the field, it was 60 days before I got my first change of clothes. So that I smelled like the jungle by then, and not very, no way of perfume that you want, but I smelled like the jungle, and all my clothes had rotted off, so to speak. Didn't have any underwear, didn't have anything other than my fatigue pants and a t-shirt.
They didn't resupply you with any clothing?
Nope.
Okay.
For 60 days they didn't.
All right. That was the first part of the 60 days where you're still in the lowlands, and then you just had the same clothes and you went with those out into the jungle.
Now when we went with the killer team and went out there, then we got camo fatigues. So we got the different color fatigues, and we would paint up our faces and did some of that to help stay out of sight.
Right. Okay. So when did the killer team thing end?
That ended just shortly before April 1st. They pulled everybody in Bravo Company back in, and we were getting ready to go to Ripcord.
Okay.
And that was planned for April 1st.
All right. So what do you remember about April 1st?
April 1st was very significant. I was, being a squad leader, I had a smoke grenade. So Ripcord, you could land 3 helicopters at the same time. And we were to try and get the combat assault in there as quickly as possible, get all the boots on the ground we could. And so I was in that first wave and had a red smoke grenade in my hand just in case we got incoming fire, and it was a hot LZ. Of course, as we started coming in, boom, 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 the mortars started coming in. And so popped red smoke, and so did the other 2 helicopters. I'm not sure who was on them, and our designation, we were given orders on what sector we were to move to. And being on one of the first ones, we were designated to go to the far end of the fire base, away from impact rock, and to go to the far point as far as we could and spread my men out there, get dug in. So we went to the far end of the fire base, and fortunately there was already a foxhole out there, and although not big enough, but it was there, and we secured that into the fire base. But mortar rounds were raining in with regularity at that point in time. And that was 8 o'clock in the morning, April 1st.
All right. Now, were the mortars targeting the area where you were, or they were mostly going for wherever the helicopters were coming?
Mostly going for wherever the helicopters were landing.
Now, how close were you to, because eventually, this is sort of a bald hilltop at this point, kind of a rocky hilltop with other hills kind of around it, and you're under fire, and eventually the fire base would have sort of 2 helipads on it. And were you close to one of the areas that the helicopters would land on
No,
later?
we weren't.
Okay.
We were, my squad was probably about as far away from the helipad as you could get, fortunately. And that was a good thing for us, because most of the round, now every now and then you would have a round that would land short of there, or long of there, or whatever else, as they were directing their fire. And you would get, shrapnel going overhead as rounds explode and whatnot, and you could hear them, the rounds coming in. That whistle is something that you never forget. So every time one would come in, of course, we'd be as low as we could get in the hole.
And were you taking any small arms fire, or was it just mortars?
Heard some 51 caliber rounds.
Yes, the machine gun.
Coming in.
All right. Did any of your men get hit that day?
In the company, well, Joe Strucky, I told you about before, he happened to be with the command group at that point in time. He was kind of the first sergeant in the field. He was an E6, and he was wounded. There were a lot of guys getting hit, a lot of wounded. As the helicopters would come in, before they could get under cover, somebody would get hit. And he was wounded. He lost an eye, and part of his arm got messed up. And that was the closest of our group, of my squad group, that would have been.
Yeah. But your own squad, those guys were.
They were intact.
Okay, so now until you go in there, kind of first thing in the morning, essentially, one of the first squads in, you dig in, you have your position set up. What happens now to you guys later in the day?
The rounds, and this is a day-long process of trying to get all the equipment, the engineers in, to get the artillery units in and all that kind of thing, attempting to get all this in here. The problem is that as you're trying to do all this, the mortar rounds are flying, and every bird that comes in, somebody gets hit. Well, that requires another medevac. And then you're loading guys on the medevac, and you put 3 or 4 guys on a medevac to get them out of there, and 2 of the guys that are helping load the bodies get hit. So, and the helicopters were going down, you know, they weren't totally disabled, but they were shot up enough to where when they got back to Evans, they took them out of commission.
Mm-hmm.
So it was constantly of, you know, what's the process here? How are you going to be able to get the wounded out without causing more wounded?
Mm-hmm. Let alone do things like set up an artillery position.
An impossible task is what it was. So later on in the day, it became very evident that this wasn't going to work. They just had it zeroed in too good. And the Cobra gunships and all that kind of thing were flying missions all day long around us, targeting potential gun sites and mortar pits and things out there in the jungle that were firing at us. And they were trying to destroy them, and most of our day was spent trying to sight where they were firing from so that we could direct fire or report back and let them know where it was coming from. And so it was just a constant juggling of trying to get the right thing done, which I don't think there was a right thing.
All right. So now how does this situation resolve itself?
Eventually someone made the decision and handed down that we weren't going to be able to maintain our position there on the hill. So the order was given that at midnight we would walk off that hill. Well, there had to be a lot of prep work done in advance of that, simply because we had, at that point in time, we had 3 KIAs, and we had all this equipment from the wounded guys, all their rucksacks and their weapons, and that was going on, 60, 65 pounds a man, and all these guys getting wounded. So what are we going to do with all of it? Well, what we ended up doing is we piled it all up in one great big pile. We buried the 3 guys that were up there and were KIAs. And then, so that we could be in position at midnight, from another fire base, an artillery unit was going to fire illumination for us. And there was a Pathfinder group up there, and they were going to lead us down off of the hill to link up with a sister company, because we were pretty well shot up at that point in time.
All right. And so how did that evacuation go?
The pucker factor went up really high, because going for a walk at midnight in triple canopy jungle is not something I would recommend. And so we were scared, and after being shot at all day long, you can imagine. We set it all up so the explosives were ready to go, and we started down off of there, followed the ridge line, and we were going to link up with Alpha Company, got a safe distance away to where they could detonate all the supplies and everything else. They wrapped it all with det cord and tied all the explosives together so it all went up in one great big charge. And after that, it was just a matter of them firing illumination continuously from midnight till 4 o'clock in the morning. And it took us 4 hours to link up with Alpha Company.
About how far do you think that distance was?
I have no idea. I really don't. I know it was a very cautious walk. It was.
So it may have just been a kilometer or something like that.
It could have been. I really don't have any idea. I know it was scary.
Were they just on one of the neighboring hills or ridges, so you're kind of going down and then back up?
Yeah, that's the way I kind of remember it. And it kind of followed a ridge line, and then back up the other side. And we had to stop at the bottom before we started to go back up, because there had to be contact made with Alpha Company, and then kind of them guide us up through and where we ought to be. And then they took us in, and we were pretty much a nervous wreck. And they took us in and put us in the center of their perimeter and said, okay guys, just crash. And it was, you can finally take a deep breath. And so it was a scary time, but it was also very, well, felt good when you finally got the crash.
All right, so what do you do the next day?
Those days after that kind of became a little bit of a blur. It just, we went several days of just patrolling around Ripcord again, and did a lot of things. There was some point in time that we actually went back to Evans. I don't remember when that was.
Because one of the other people from the company I interviewed talked about being out there and pretty much running out of food.
We did that, absolutely. It was a point in time when the weather got really bad, and we were socked in, and they couldn't get us resupplied, and we were out of food. And I remember nobody had any sea rations, and one of the guys had a little tin with some crackers in it, 4 crackers, and some cheese, and he was offered $20 for that little, and that's all there was. And but we were hungry. We were just flat hungry, and ended up, they couldn't get an LZ. We couldn't get an LZ cut there for us, but Delta Company had gotten resupplied. So Delta Company took all of our supplies as well, and it was just our process to link up with them. So that's what we did. We spent a while trying to get with them, and then once we got to them, there again, it was the same thing, because we were short in numbers. Our company size was probably, I don't know, I'm thinking there were only 35 or something like that in our entire company.
How many do you think you took on to Ripcord originally?
Probably 75.
Yeah.
Somewhere in that neighborhood. So when we linked up with Delta Company, then they took us in. They knew we'd been without for a long time, and Captain Rollison said, you guys go in, get your sea rations, eat as much as you want, just sit down and relax. Don't worry, we got you covered. And so that was, there again, that was one of those, made it through this one.
Okay, so part of what's going on at this point is the weather's bad enough it's hard to be able to get back in and really conduct operations effectively because you can't resupply, let alone establish a base up on top of Ripcord. Okay, so you do that. Eventually you do get back to Evans, and then you go back out in the field again?
Yeah, we went back out in the field, and more of the same search and destroy missions, looking for the enemy, trying to figure out troop strength, preparing to go for another assault on Ripcord. I knew that Alpha Company had tried in March to take the hill. We had tried April, and so I assumed that it was probably going to be one of the other 2 companies that were going to try it the next time. So we were out in the jungle, and I was tickled to death to be there, to be honest about it. I felt safer out there than having mortar rounds raining in on your head.
And then Charlie Company then goes up, I guess, on 10th or 11th of April. And
Yeah,
they walk up the side and for some reason don't get shot at.
for some reason, and had the opportunity to actually establish a fire base. And of course, they had the perfect man there to do it in Izzy.
Vasquez.
Yeah, Izzy, I call him. Captain Vasquez was up there, and of course didn't know about this until many decades later. His true expertise and why he knew what he knew. You know, he was the man, and all my respect for that individual. But then it was, so that would have been mid-April. We were kind of on a rotation then. For as I recall, it was 2 weeks. We had 4 companies: Alpha, Bravo, Delta,
Charlie, yeah.
And we were on the fire base providing perimeter support for 2 weeks, and then 6 weeks out in the jungle was basically what it was. So we were patrolling around Ripcord, just doing the same old thing, trying to survive. And along came May, and we were out in the field, and we probably had an objective to get to a certain point, but it was actually, and I had expressed my opinion that that's too far to try and travel in one day. You can't move that far. And we had a relatively new lieutenant, matter of fact, very new, but he was going to try and impress the brass, and he stretched how far we should travel.
And were the platoons operating separately at this point?
Yes.
Okay.
And so, and I may have been in a position at that point in time where I was a platoon sergeant.
Mm-hmm.
And so we tried to move farther than we could. We got to that position, we made it, but it didn't give us time to set up listening posts, to get dug in, to scout the area and see what we were, to get our claymores set up or any of that kind of thing. We didn't have time to do that because it was dark.
Mm-hmm.
So here we were, and we got in there, and we dropped our rucksacks, and the guys are exhausted and hadn't had anything to eat when all hell broke loose. And they opened up on the 5th of May and started firing, and RPGs and small arms fire, machine gun fire, a lot of EKs.
Now, were you on a hilltop or inside of one? Or?
Kind of on a little rise,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit. We weren't way high up, but it was a little bit of a rise,
Mm-hmm.
and because that was the best place we could find to try and get a vantage point. I immediately picked up the radio because I had a lot of training in mortars
Mm-hmm.
from NCO school.
Mm-hmm.
So I could act as a forward observer, and the first thing I did was got a hold of Ripcord and got a hold of the mortar platoon and called in a fire mission and started walking mortar rounds in on them.
Mm-hmm.
And the lieutenant, I didn't really have much contact with him after that. I think it was his first firefighter, first
Mm-hmm.
experience, so he was pretty rattled. And so I handled that, and I probably made my biggest mistake is in order to see where the rounds were firing so I could direct them, I got up on top of a rock and had the radio in my hand. Well, RPG round landed relatively close,
Mm-hmm.
and I got hit in the neck and knocked me off the rock, and we had four or five of the guys that got some shrapnel. No one was killed,
Mm-hmm.
but we were shot up, and we got the enemy was dispersed. They quit firing, but the problem was they couldn't get a helicopter in to get the wounded out, and they said, well, we'll just have to wait till morning because there was no LZ anywhere around us. So we spent that night out there, and then they came in the next day and they took all of us wounded out in a jungle penetrator.
Mm-hmm. And can describe what that was for someone who's never heard of one.
A jungle penetrator is a pronged seat that they lower down on a cable from a helicopter. So the helicopter has to hover and drop this down through the trees, and then you get on the seat and hang on, and they pull you, elevate you out without the helicopter ever landing.
All right, and they had to do that for 5 guys?
Yep.
Did it have to be one at a time that they did that?
Well, they actually brought in 2 birds. And
Okay.
They brought in 2 of them, one after the other one,
Mhm.
and so we got to go. And we went to Da Nang. We went straight to Da Nang from the jungle.
Okay. And then how long were you away from the unit then?
Had surgery on that next day, and then was in the hospital there, woke up in intensive care, was in the hospital there for probably 3-4 days, and then went from there to Cam Ranh Bay to recover because they had left the wound open to allow it to drain. And I was there for, I would say, 2.5 weeks,
Okay.
something like that, in Cam Ranh.
Now, while you were there, were you able to get up and move around, or did they keep you in the bed?
No, I was able to get up and move around, and really didn't. The scariest part was at the hospital when we went in there, because nobody was hurt terribly bad, and I was hit in the neck, but didn't feel bad or anything. But the doctor came out and said, Sergeant Hansmann, and I said, yeah. He said, I want you to just remain still. And I said, okay, what's going on? And they brought out a gurney and laid me down on a gurney and told me not to move. And they took me in, and what they found out was one piece of the shrapnel, a long piece, was lodged between my jugular vein and my spinal cord. And it was very close to both. And so they had, I guess, some tricky surgery to get it out without messing something up worse. But it all turned out fine, and it healed up. Some of the shrapnel's still in there, but
Okay, at this point, this tape is about done, so we're going to pause right here. Okay, now we were talking about you were being treated at Cam Ranh Bay, done the operation, you're recovering from that, you can kind of get around and that sort of thing. So at what point, was there anything else about that stay that you wanted to bring into the story before we take you back to your unit?
it was everything went well with the recovery. Spent some time going to movies, doing some things that most people would consider kind of normal, and yeah, it was a good time frame.
So it was kind of a vacation.
Yeah, it was kind of a vacation.
All right. So when do you rejoin your unit?
Rejoined the unit then sometime the very first part of June, and went back to the unit and was basically, I rejoined them on Ripcord. I flew out to Ripcord, and then was out there for a few days because I think the unit was providing perimeter security, but then sometime very shortly after that, we went back out to the field.
Okay.
So we walked off Ripcord, somebody else took our place. And we were out in the field, and that was until June 12th, my son was born. Okay? And he contracted, my wife's had problems in childbirth, and he contracted double pneumonia. And was in really tough shape. Well, of course, I didn't know all this was going on back there at that point in time. It was a few days after he was born that helicopter came out and had a chaplain on it. And once again, they said, we need to see Sergeant Hansmann. And whenever that happens, something bad is going on. He came over and he says, I've got this for you, Sarge. And it was a Western Union telegram. And the only thing that it says on the telegram is, your wife has given birth to a son, baby's condition terminal, wife's condition doubtful. And that's all it was on. So I was, needless to say, very upset, emotional. And he said, Sarge, the chaplain said, Sarge, we're going to take you back. You've been granted a 30-day emergency leave to go back home and take care of your family. So got on a helicopter, went back, still have no idea what's going on and no way to find out what's going on. Went back to the base and turned in all my gear everything, and First Sergeant was there, and he helped me with getting everything processed and everything done that needed to do, and was very compassionate with what was going on, and helped me get all that done. Got on a plane and went down to, I suppose, to Cam Ranh or Da Nang somewhere, and got on a bird to go back home. Flew back home, flew into SeaTac again, and it was then in Seattle that I was finally able to make a phone call, and got a hold of the family, and found out that my son had survived, and my wife was doing fine, and that by the time I got home from Seattle, they were going to be able to come home. So everything turned out beautifully. But and the backstory to that, my wife's doctor, who was delivered the baby and everything, was a Vietnam vet. He was an Army doctor in Vietnam. So he knew what procedures it took to get me home and all that, and he did. And so my son recovered from the pneumonia, and although it stunted his growth some, he's only 6'5" and 230. But everything turned out well, and so I got to spend 30 days here in the States, and then the hard part was I had to get on that plane and come back. So then it was probably 14th of July or something like that, I came back to Vietnam. Went back up, took several days to get from Cam Ranh back up to the company unit, get my gear and everything, and was getting ready to go back out to Ripcord. Well, that got into right around the 20th or so of July.
Okay.
And Top came down and said, "Sarge, we're getting ready to pull everybody off that hill. There's no sense in you going out there." So I waited then and rejoined my group when they came back. I was on the pad as they came back.
All right. And what had you been able to learn during that time about what had happened out at Ripcord while you were gone?
Just the stories that First Sergeant and I would sit down and he would share with me what was going on and how bad it was, and all the things that had happened. And at that point in time, that was the beginning of my struggle with survivor's guilt, I guess. Okay, this ain't good.
Because you had missed, because your company had been up there in the first 3 weeks of July, and that's when the base came under heavy bombardment, and eventually a helicopter crashed on the 18th and blew up the ammo dump, and after that, they kind of had to go. But those guys had been through all of that, and you were off doing all this other stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, so the 23rd of July is when they actually evacuate the base. And what did you do that day?
That day I was down on the helicopter pad and just helping the guys with their stuff, greeting old friends and consoling them, and just, and there was absolutely they didn't feel from their perspective like I felt from mine, that I wasn't there to help. They said, "Sarge, there's nothing you could do." There was nothing we could do. But.
And the company didn't lose too many men at that point. They
No.
had taken some wounded, not too many killed. But still, they'd gone through all of that, and you hadn't. Once they're back, now what happens to you in the company?
I think we went to Eagle Beach, and then we're, kind of getting everything realigned and kind of figured out. Everybody was trying to figure out, where do we go from here, and what do we do? So we went. Eventually, we went back out in the field again, and in different AOs. I don't even remember where.
Was this still in the mountains or hill country?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was. And so we went back out and we were doing that, and then I went on an R&R because I hadn't taken one and I was still eligible for one. Around the 8th of August, as I recall, and met my wife in Hawaii, which was, again, you know, a relatively short period of time since I'd seen her. It was really fun, and we had a good time together. And after that, went back to the company, doing the same old things again, and the same procedure, you know, being in the jungle and whatnot.
Was there much contact at that time? Was it quiet?
It seemed like it was a lot quieter at that point in time. And I had gotten to know our first sergeant really well, and I told him, okay, at some point in time, as I'm getting shorter here, or have seen, you know, been wounded once and have been through several things, if the opportunity presents itself and you can pull me out of the field, send me to, I said, I'm trained in mortars. I said, you know, just send me to a mortar platoon, and, you know, that'd be good if it works out. And it took a while, but sometime in later September, then something opened up, and he said, Sergeant, going to move you into mortar platoon for your last period of time. And so I was up there and got to know a lot of the guys, became a squad leader there in the mortar platoon. Didn't know anything about mortars because I'd forgotten everything I learned. But there again, I was in the same situation, and they knew where I'd been and what I'd done, so they were very comfortable with, they knew their jobs, they didn't need me. And so I just did whatever was necessary to help them out and make their job easier. So the last 6 weeks or so, I was there, and that was really a good deal. And to put it time-wise in perspective, you think, well, that doesn't add up to a year. But while I was home for that 30-day leave, my father-in-law made me an offer. He was a farmer, and he said, "What are you going to do when you come home?" And I was in college. I was an accounting major, and I said, "I cannot see myself sitting in an office." I said, "I'd go nuts." And he says, "Well, you want to come home and help farm?" And I said, "I'd love to." So I put in for an early out to go home and help with the harvest, which was very legitimate. And so I ended up getting an early out to come home and help farm in November.
All right. Now, in the meantime, I guess with the mortar platoon, were they usually on a fire base somewhere?
Yes, I was on Fire Base Kathryn, and that's where I met Pops, John Hedrick, and a lot of the guys. Matter of fact, one of the guys I'd been through NCO school was there as well. So, and it was relatively quiet at that point in time.
And would the base take any incoming of one kind or another, or was it just quiet?
Very little, if any.
All right.
Very little. We would hear some AK fire every now and then, and of course, having been out there and been involved in several different contacts and firefights and whatnot, I could tell how far away it was. I could tell which direction it was firing and all that. And it was kind of funny because the mortar guys would, as soon as they heard an AK go off, they'd grab a helmet that was buried underground, and I was standing up there looking around because you can tell what's going on and when you need to get down and when you don't.
Yeah. All right. So at some point back before the end of Ripcord, sometimes mortars would actually go out in the field, at least briefly, with units.
Yeah.
But you weren't doing that at this
No,
point.
we were not doing
Going
it.
out there then. Okay. A couple other kinds of questions. There's sort of a lot of stereotypes about Vietnam and what went on over there and so forth. One of them has to do with just the question of race and racial tensions. Did you observe any of that yourself, or?
No, we really, we had no problems whatsoever. We had, at some point in time there, and I don't remember, we had a platoon sergeant come in. His name was Jim Burdett, and very educated. He had a master's degree in mathematics, and he was an E6, but he was drafted just like the rest of us. Went through NCO school.
Yeah.
Very intelligent, 6'5" black guy who commanded a lot of respect, but was a really super intelligent, nice guy. And that kind of kept, I think, any racial, that kept it down, although we didn't have any before that either.
Well, you spent most of your time in the field too.
Yeah, and there's no room for that.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess, and that may apply to another one of the stereotypes, and has to do with drug use. I mean, when you were back.
Absolutely none.
Yeah.
Wouldn't stand for it. I wouldn't stand for it, and neither did anybody else. And we just, that was something, now when they were in the rear area or the Eagle Beach or something like that, was some of that done? Could have been. I have no idea.
Right.
But when we were in the field, it was absolutely taboo. You didn't do that because you were going to get yourself killed and somebody else too. So.
Yeah. And also, how much did you see of the Vietnamese themselves? I mean, did you have any Kit Carson scouts around or anything like that?
We had a Kit Carson scout on a few different occasions, not for long periods of time. We found them rather worthless because they didn't want to walk point. They didn't want to walk slack. They wanted to walk at the rear. And they wouldn't carry their share of the load. They wouldn't work. I had no use for them personally, but it's kind of like the scout dog philosophy, and we had that one episode with a scout dog that he led us right straight into an ambush, and the dog died, and the handler got all shot up, and all those kinds of things. And
Because the Kit Carson scouts were supposed to be enemy soldiers who turned themselves in, who could then show things to you. And in some cases, it seemed to be people who were avoiding the South Vietnamese army. But so it kind of varied for how useful any of them were. So you've got that. Now, did you see any Vietnamese civilians, like on the base camps or around them?
just back when we were in the rear, really didn't see. There were a few occasions when we saw some mountain yards. Woodcutters, you used to call them. They would be out cutting trees or whatever, and saw a few of those, but as far as much Vietnamese population, only in the rear area. If they were in the jungle and they were Vietnamese, they were a target, in our opinion.
Yeah, because there weren't really regular villages or things out there in that
there
area.
were not.
Okay. Now, in the rear area, I mean, were these people who were just working on the bases, or were there villages around, or?
There were villages around, and they were doing, hooch maids or whatever else, and that type of stuff, working in some of the mess halls and that kind of thing. So,
Yeah, but you didn't spend really any time in these built-up
Very,
developed
very
areas
little.
particularly at all. Okay. And what understanding did you have, but by the time you left, how did you view the war itself?
Frustrated would probably be the biggest word that would come to mind, simply because of my experience with Ripcord. We tried to take it in March, we tried to take it in April, we took it later on in April and established it, and we're up there, got a lot of guys killed, a ton of guys wounded, and we had no idea until decades later what kind of enemy force we were dealing with, and then ended up just walking away from it and giving it all back to them. And I have a hard time figuring out exactly what we accomplished, And my only way of justifying everything is somebody else has to live with the decisions that were made
Mm-hmm.
and why they were made. I only have to live with the decision that I did what my duty was as a soldier,
Right.
and supported the leadership by doing what they asked, and supported my men by trying to take care of them as best I could.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, what's the process for getting you home? Once you get orders, you can leave. Now, what do they do with you?
It was just a matter of like a day or two before I was supposed to go home. Came back to the rear, got everything turned in, cleaned up, new set of fatigues, all those kinds of things. It was kind of a fast blur at that point, trying to say goodbye to people and hoping that they made it. Got on a plane, went to Seattle, went through a process. I think I was there probably a week or so, processing out, getting physical, and got a new set of dress screens and had a good meal and whatnot. And then went to the airport, and I thought, boy, it can only be great from here. And I walked in the airport, and of course here's all the protesters, and had signs everywhere. And I walked, first thing it is, I went to the bathroom, walked in there, and here's a trash can overflowing with dress screens.
Mm-hmm.
Guys didn't want to have to deal with all the protesters, so they put on civilian clothes. Of course, it's, you can tell a soldier's been in a war real quick, and it didn't do them any good to change their clothes, but that's what they did. And I thought, that's really sad. That is truly sad to see that, those dress screens just running out the top of a garbage can. That image is still burnt in my brain, and I thought, okay guys, I just went through a war. If you think you're gonna get me to take this off, I got news for you. Have at it.
Mm-hmm.
So I left mine on and very proudly walked out there. And I didn't have any, they weren't interested in real confrontation. They
Right.
just wanted to be loud. So I just ignored them. Got on a plane and flew home.
All right. And so when do you actually get back home? It's now November,
Had to be-
December?
It had to be in November.
Okay.
And I actually felt a commitment because I had been given the drop to go home and farm. I got home, and the next day I was on a tractor. And that's one of my bigger regrets, is that I didn't take time to decompress.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a matter of a week earlier, I'd been in the jungle carrying a rifle and shooting at people.
Yeah.
And I didn't come home and take the time to decompress because I felt they gave me this drop. It's my responsibility to do what I said I was going to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I went home and I farmed.
Okay. And so now what was the readjustment process like for you then?
It was a struggle. I was a different individual. And to try and come home, and I was very devoted to my family, to my wife, but I didn't know how to do that. And she didn't know how to react to me either.
Mm-hmm.
And it was hard. It was a tough experience for us to try and live through that, being two totally different people, because now she was a mother,
Mm-hmm.
and I hadn't been there for that process, and I was just a totally different. The pictures look like 10 years difference.
Mm-hmm.
So
And so how did you deal with that or sort things out?
kept it inside.
Mm-hmm.
Tried to do what I thought people wanted to see. It wasn't exactly who I was, and didn't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the that was the problem. and didn't discover how big of a problem until years and years later. And didn't really talk a whole lot about it until my first Ripcord reunion.
Okay, and when was that?
That was the first year it was in Indianapolis.
Okay.
This is my fourth. So we were 2 years at Myrtle Beach, and then 2 years before that.
Okay, so yeah, 2011 was the...
Yeah.
All right, and did you manage to stay married all that time?
Interesting. Now we're going to get kind of personal.
Well,
here,
you can talk about it or not.
I will.
I
will. There are no holds barred here. My wife and I were married for 30 years. And it just, through the process of the war and whatnot, and a lot of other issues, she said that she wanted a divorce. And we went to counseling and whatnot, and the counselor began to drag out, the psychologist began to drag out some of this Vietnam stuff. He sensed that that was part of it, and he started part of that. And Laura began to hear some things that she had never heard before. But anyway, she filed for divorce, and we got divorced in 1998. And I didn't want it, and she called me the day the divorce was final and said, "Paul, I think I made a mistake." And my comment to that was, "No shit." But I said, "You got what you wanted," so I walked away. And it was about, 1999, December 23rd, we got remarried. And have been together and happy ever since.
And so now, after that, as a kind of product of all of that, the counseling, were you starting to get some counseling or some support by this time?
Not a lot at that point in time. I became, because she started asking more questions then. And so I did start to open up more. And then along came a job change, and some other things went on, and we moved from Iowa to Illinois, and eventually came in contact with Craig Van Hout called me, and talked to me some, and then he talked about there was an Illinois group that they were getting together for just the guys from Illinois. They're going to have lunch, and it was relatively close by, half an hour from us. Apprehensive about going to that and whatever, but Laura finally prodded me into doing that, and we did, and met some guys, and we went out, laid a wreath at the cemetery there and whatnot, and got to know the guys, Floyd Alexander and Dale Lane and some of those guys, George Murphy. And they said, "You've got to go to a reunion, Paul. You've got to." And Floyd, it was fascinating because he helped me out. Back in your mind, you wonder whether or not you remember the things that really happened. And so I was talking with Floyd about April 1st, and he said, April 1st, that was the only time I was in Vietnam that we had to get resupplied with illumination rounds in the middle of the night to fire illumination for you guys. And so he just verified, the whole thing. So anyway, then I said, okay, so I signed up for the reunion in 2011, and we went, and it was probably the best thing I ever did. And Laura's comment, who was a speech and English teacher, said it was fascinating to sit by the side and just watch you guys. Everybody's speaking the same language. You don't have to explain what a CA is, or what an LZ is, or what an RPG is, or you don't have to explain anything. You just talk to one another because you all speak the same language. And so it just kind of grew from there. And she still thinks I've got PTSD, which, yeah, I probably do. To an extent.
It's the sort of thing where different people deal with it in different ways. You actually did what an awful lot of the World War II and Korea guys did. And that is you're carrying the baggage with you and you just kind of put it away. And it does affect your behavior and how you interact with people in certain ways and that sort of stuff. So likely, yeah, if you go to the psychologist, they would diagnose that. But I'm not a psychologist, so I'm just a historian. But that's, you know, but ultimately, that was what you were always expected to do, was just suck it up.
That's what my dad did.
And go forward. And sometimes that works, and sometimes if you're able to talk about it, you work it through, you get control of it, and it doesn't rule you in the same way. And clearly your relationship with your wife has changed because of it. So that may help. And certainly connecting with the guys who were there can be tremendously helpful. And in the meantime, what it's done is it's enabled you to sort out your story well enough that you've done a very good job of telling it today.
Thank
So
you.
I'd like to thank you for coming in and sharing.
Thank you.
All right.